Also, herzlichen Dank, Herr Warburton, für die Einladung, für die Möglichkeit, noch wieder über alte Wirtschaftsgeschichte hier in Berlin zu diskutieren. Es tut mir wirklich leid, dass ich noch wieder auf Englisch spreche und nicht Deutsch. Nächstes Mal versprochen. Aber die letzten paar Monate war einfach viel zu beschäftigt und mein Deutsch ist noch ein bisschen mittelmäßig. The aim of my paper this evening is to consider in two different aspects a theme and an ancient source that are not generally considered from an economic perspective. The theme is the water supply of ancient Rome, the ancient city of Rome, and the text is our major source for understanding that subject, namely the book De Aquis, on aqueducts, by the Roman author Sextus Julius Frontanus. The idea is in part to consider these themes from an economic perspective, in the hope of shedding new light upon them, that if we consider the operation of the Roman water supply in its economic dimension, rather than in the usual manner, which is a much more technical approach to understanding the construction of the channels, their capacities, their ability to supply different uses within the city, and so forth, that we will understand something additional about this aspect of the city of Rome. And likewise, when we look at Frontinus' text from an economic perspective, this may reveal things that we have not previously noticed. Taking ideas from modern economic thought is simply a way of raising new questions, suggesting new ways of reading. In particular, in the case of Frontinus, my interest is in expanding our idea of Roman economic thought in the broadest sense. Now, traditionally, historians have tried to understand Roman economic thought in what we might call a binary manner. Either it is judged to be a precursor of modern economic theory, or at least that we can identify modern economic conceptions, means-orientated rationalism and so forth, in the texts from the Roman period, or, at the other extreme, it is categorized or condemned as, so to speak, primitive, as evidence that the Romans were not at all like us, and therefore, by implication, their economy was not in the least bit modern. They would be incapable of developing a more modern economy because they lacked the conceptual tools, and their conceptual tools are held to reflect the condition of their economy, and therefore their relatively primitive development is a sign that the economy itself must have been relatively primitive. Now, put in these simplistic terms, I imagine it's obvious that this is a false dichotomy. It is to establish an unhelpful understanding of Roman economic thought, or indeed of economic thought in general, as either a fully developed law-orientated theory or as nothing. Now, manifestly, this does not cover the majority of instances we could think of economic thought in a broad sense, even in our own society, let alone in history. What I mean by Roman economic thought is not anything resembling an explicit abstract theory, but rather the range of principles, of conceptions, of rules of thumb, of ideas, of values that influenced the behaviour that we would label economic, that influenced their actions in relation to production, distribution, consumption, and so forth. It's an approach to economic thought that has become increasingly important, of course, in modern economics. The move away from a crude model of human beings as rational maximizers towards the actual study of how people make decisions. Behavioral economics, the study of actual economic decision-making, all of these point to the importance of conceptions, values, ideas, sometimes not even consciously expressed ideas, in shaping people's behaviour. Now, for historians, this is a much more inviting approach, because it places more emphasis on what we might term culture. It places more emphasis on the particular values of whichever period we happen to be looking at. The specific aspects of the Roman world and of our Roman sources are not now something to be discarded, rather they are the subject of interest. What can we establish of the way that the Romans understood the world around them in economic terms, or in relation to decisions that we would think of as economic? So the aim of looking at Frontinus is in part because this is not a text dealing with economics. It's not a text dealing with a topic that we would necessarily associate with economics, unlike, say, the Roman agronomists, where there has been at least some move towards trying to identify the principles according to which they organised their agricultural enterprises. The idea of looking at Frontinus is precisely to see what patterns of thought, what modes of analysis we can identify in his approach to the theme of water. That is going to be the central part of my lecture this evening, the beginnings of a sketch of Frontinus' analytical and conceptual approach. But this is set within a broader topic, as I have said, the water supply of the city of Rome. We can take it for granted that water is a fundamental economic resource. It is vital in any society, not only for sustaining human life, but for the process of production in the broadest sense. Water is necessary for pastoral peoples to support their flocks, it's necessary for agricultural peoples for growing crops, and it's necessary for almost any manufacturing or industrial process you care to mention. When we look at the city of Rome, you could say we are looking at a particularly large problem of economic coordination. A city that, by the time of Augustus, had grown, depending on your estimates, to somewhere between 750,000 and 1 million people, represents an enormous market, an enormous number of mouths that need to be fed, an enormous number of people who need to be supplied with different goods, including water and including goods that require water for their manufacturing, and indeed including a range of services where water is a vital component. So understanding the ways in which water was brought to the city and distributed within the city, understanding the different ways in which individuals and enterprises gained access to the water they needed, and the nature of the process that determined that distribution, is vital for understanding how this city was able to work. It is also perhaps going to help us understand more generally how economic systems, including the support of the city of Rome, were organised within the Roman world. Now, the traditional image of the city of Rome, which ancient historians have long since discarded, but on the assumption that there may be sort of historians and economists of other periods, I will sort of fill this in. The traditional image of the city of Rome is, of course, that of Juvenal's line about bread and circuses, the idea of a city which was organised entirely through the intervention of the state, that the people were fed by the state and provided with entertainment by the state, and otherwise this city essentially did nothing. Now, this idea has long since been discarded, at least partially. The most effort in research has focused on the food supply, where, it is certainly true, there were state grain distributions. The Roman state gathered grain as tax in kind from various provinces, and some of this grain was distributed to members of the population of the city of Rome. But this is not to say that the entire food supply was simply a matter of state distribution. Not everyone was entitled to receive this handout of grain. It was necessary to be on a list of recipients. Certainly not the entire population was on those lists. The grain was handed out, so far as we can see, in the form of grain. At the very least, it was necessary to have a range of milling facilities and of bakers, not to mention the range of other foodstuffs that the population of Rome would have needed to supplement this basic handout of staple crop. So in other words, even if we see the food supply of Rome in terms of state redistribution playing an important role, that can never be the full story. Rather, the interventions of the state in redistributing goods it had gathered from the rest of the empire, and in addition, occasionally intervening in the operations of the market when prices rose too high and there were signs of unrest amongst the general population. Even if we accept, as I think we have to, that this plays a crucial role in the economy of the city, it can never be the full story. It is one part of a much more complicated, interlocking market. Different means of moving goods into the city, redistribution, reciprocity, members of the elite transporting their own goods, as well as straightforward market systems bringing in goods from the whole of Italy and from beyond. In other words, the system is always more complicated than the traditional cliché of an idle population. It's not to say that Rome was ever a centre of manufacturing for export, but it was certainly not a merely passive consumer. And what I want to suggest is broadening our study of this general theme to understand the workings not only of the grain supply, but of the water supply, and indeed of other aspects of the urban economy, can help us understand how the Romans organise complex processes. That is the broader context. I want to start with Frontinus's work. We've got a number of passages from Frontinus on the handout. Again, I'm afraid one reason I am speaking in English is that I could not find a German translation of Frontinus easily. I assume there is one, but I don't know. And so I'm afraid you have the Latin and the English. But I will sketch in some of the important themes in reading his work. Sextus Julius Frontinus is someone we know only from what he says about himself and a few passing mentions in other sources. He was praetor, one of the levels of Roman magistrate, in 70 CE. This was a post normally held in the mid-30s, so it is assumed he was born sometime around 35. He was consul 3 times in 73, 98 and 100, and after his first consulship he spent some time as the governor of the province of Britannia. He then spent about 20 years entirely off the radar. We don't know what he was doing between his first and his second consulship, except that there are various writings which we might as well date to this period. He wrote a very large book about military stratagems, so in fact, he's not commonly put into the pantheon of great military writers along with people like Clausewitz, but he could be. But our main interest in Frontinus comes when in 97, just before his second consulship, he's appointed to the position of curator aquarum, the curator of aqueducts, the man appointed by the emperor to oversee the water supply of the city of Rome, a post which we assume he may have held for the rest of his life. Certainly he held this for a considerable period. What is striking is that Frontinus took the opportunity to research his new role and to write it all down. And he explains in the preface to his book that he felt he could not do the job properly if he had to rely solely on his subordinates for information. So he turned to his own researches, both empirical, and if you read the middle part of Frontinus' work, which is the section that most people normally skip because it is very boring, but it is a very, very careful analysis of all the different sizes of water pipe to be found around the city, the underlying principles of the sizing, calculations of water capacity, and a passing account of the efforts he had put in to carrying out his own measurements to try to determine the capacity of the various aqueducts that flowed into the city of Rome, the way that they related to one another, and so forth. So we hear about Frontinus's own empirical research. We hear in passing about his research in existing imperial records, particularly those established earlier in the reign of Trajan, and we hear about his reading of decrees of the Senate, other sources of research. So a very thorough attempt at bringing himself up to speed with the history of the aqueducts and the task of overseeing them, and comments on his own experiences in doing this, partly as a kind of aide-memoire, something that might be useful for his successors, partly, we may imagine, as a display of his own qualities as an administrator. We are given a strong impression of what Frontinus wishes us to see, namely his diligence, his wish to serve the emperor, his praise of the emperor, his praise of the aqueducts of Rome, and so forth. There's an emphasis throughout on the importance of knowledge as a basis for making correct decisions. It's an enormously rich text, if you're interested in aqueducts. What I want to focus on, as I say, is what we can say more generally about how Frontinus thinks. It's rather in the spirit of some readings over the last sort of couple of decades of the elder Pliny, who you could say is another example of this kind of Roman, someone who dedicates himself to gathering knowledge and, at least to some extent, to analysing knowledge. The Roman emphasis on non-fictional writing as a particular display of certain kinds of virtues. I want to begin then, firstly, with the respects in which Frontinus seems, one might almost say, modern. Certainly that Frontinus recognises what we would tend to recognise as the particular task of managing the distribution of a scarce resource, of managing a state enterprise. Certainly, this is his basic assumption. Water is abundant, but it is always limited. A constant concern in his writing is that there may be insufficient for all the needs, all the demands, and so the task of the curator of aqueducts, or at least the primary task, is to guarantee the supply as far as possible. Water is identified from the beginning as important, to the extent to which Frontinus does not go into great detail about why it is important. It is largely taken for granted. He identifies the range of different uses to which water is put and can be put. And this is mentioned in passing in the passages under 2 on the handout. Water he sees to be distributed to public uses via fountains, to public works in the broadest sense, which appear to include various state-owned buildings, possibly state-owned enterprises such as the large milling complex we know to have existed on the Janiculum Hill, though Frontinus has little to say about mills. Water is distributed to water basins. It is distributed in the name of Caesar. It is distributed for private uses through grants of the emperor. There's a sense that these are, at least sometimes, competing uses. And certainly, according to Frontinus' scale of values, the public use is always most important. It's not that he wishes to exclude private use of water altogether, though there are times when he embarks on the history of Rome's water supply, when he seems to look back with nostalgia to the early centuries when water was for public use only, except for a few of the leading citizens who were allowed to lead water into their houses by general consent of the others. The implication is clearly that by Frontinus' time, far more water is going for private ends than he feels wholly comfortable with, or at any rate that this is identified as something that is at least a potential problem in the event that there are shortages. He focuses, as I say, on the idea that water can be distributed to different users. It can be distributed to different parts of the city in proportion to their needs. And indeed, he identifies as a problem the fact that this has not always happened in the past. There is at least the potential in his discussion for developing the idea of trade-offs. He's also focused, if not indeed slightly obsessed, on the idea of consistent principles. This becomes obvious in his discussion of water pipe sizes, where he is actually disturbed by the fact that of the 15 or so regular sizes of water pipe used within the Roman distribution system for different purposes, some of these do not quite fit a regular measure. His argument is that things concerned with measurement should be fixed and consistent. And I've given you the quote for this under section 5 on measurement and record keeping. He devotes, as I say, a considerable amount of time to trying to analyse the principle behind different sizes of pipe and their supposed capacities, and to relating this to existing records in order to establish an overall system. Now, this is, as I say, not the most exciting material you could encounter, and it's written in a Latin which becomes ever more abbreviated and impenetrable. But the importance, I think, is the insistence on a principle. the approach to understanding phenomena by seeking to identify a single repeated principle, a ratio, which can be applied in any situation. Frontinus' ideal is that every single type of water pipe in use should be proportionate to every other one. Only then, in his view, can he reach a full understanding of the capacity of the Roman water system, the amount of water it actually delivers, the amount of water that it is supposed to deliver. So on the one hand, I think we can sort of identify something distinctly even modern, certainly distinctly scientific in his approach. At the same time, there are a great many gaps in his account. There are things that he does not discuss, which we might have wished for him to discuss, or indeed we might wonder at his failure to mention them. There is a passing mention of the fact that the water supply might in practice vary from year to year. Clearly, this is a problem he identifies in making measurements, or to be more exact, it's a problem he anticipates from those whose work he is criticising. Because underlying much of this effort is Frontinus' drive to demonstrate that the capacity of the aqueducts has been underestimated, but also that water is being lost through different sorts of fraud and malpractice and incompetence. So he seeks to establish a total in order, we can surmise, to confront his subordinates with their failings. He anticipates the response that he is simply measured at the wrong time of year, that their calculations were based on, for example, taking the readings in July when the volume of water would naturally be lower. So Frontinus explicitly says he took his measurements in July so that these will work as minima, and therefore anything his subordinates may say can be discounted. Now, we could anticipate the response that, well, we did it in a particularly dry July, but he doesn't go that far. But he doesn't have much more to say about seasonal or annual variation. And I suppose we could simply conclude that he has established to his own satisfaction the minimum capacity of the Roman water system, and he uses that as his basis for calculation. Certainly there's no indication that he would be concerned if more water were available. He is interested in the amount that he can count on, which is then taken to be sufficient for private uses once all public uses have been taken care of. If there is more water in the system, then that is simply better for everybody. It's not an excuse to grant more private licenses. There are similar hints of this kind of calculation in other parts of Frontinus' work. His brief discussion of the importance of repairs, for example. Very brief discussion, where he indicates that on the one hand, it is important to carry out repairs in good time for fear of greater losses if things are allowed to get out of hand. So there's an insistence on the need for a regular repair program and a complaint about his predecessors that various aqueducts had been allowed to go to rack and ruin, that they had been leaking, and that this had made it easier for people to defraud the system because losses in the system were assumed to be the result of decaying aqueduct infrastructure rather than the result of people stealing water. And again, Frontinus' explanation for most things is deliberate fraud followed by neglect and only very far at the bottom, actual accident and natural leakage. So Frontinus identifies the need for repairs, the need to make a calculation of when would it be more expensive to allow something to carry on? But again, he's more concerned with the risk that there are people urging repairs for their own selfish interests. He argues that you must be suspicious of people saying that the water conduits need repair because they may well be contractors looking to get the contract to do the repair, given that the Roman aqueduct system has an only limited supply of workers at its disposal. So there is a concern with making the right decision on the basis of suitable information, but Frontinus largely defines the information problem in terms of people wanting to lie to him, that he cannot wholly trust his subordinates, he cannot trust the people who would be putting in tenders to do the repair work. It's particularly notable that he makes no attempt at calculating the actual needs of Rome when it comes to water, perhaps because such a calculation would be impossible. For the most part, there is no attempt at defining how much water an individual might require as the basis for any calculation of Rome's overall needs. And indeed, it remains an open question whether the Roman authorities had any real idea of the population of Rome. Certainly, they don't leave any evidence that this was something that they had, directly sought to establish, though it's possible to hypothesize means by which they might have reached a figure. But even if such a figure exists, Frontinus has no interest in it. His assumption is that the existing number of fountains and water basins distributed around the different regions of the city through which water was constantly flowing, that this would be sufficient for however many people wanted to use them. It's only, in terms of his text, it is only when an aqueduct has to be shut down for repair that areas of the city suffer an absolute loss of water supply. So in general, his concern is not with the population as a whole, or even with the various public works. And he doesn't actually show very much interest in the number of private grants for water. The fact that it was possible to obtain a rescript from the emperor which could be taken to the curator of aqueducts or his deputies to be given permission to run a private pipe from one of the water reservoirs. Now, clearly, this is an important part of the organisation of Rome's water supply. This is how private users, particularly those in business or in crafts who needed water, presumably would have gained access to the supply. Frontinus is concerned with these, but not their volume. He's concerned with their legality. It is effectively, as far as he is concerned, the emperor can grant as many such permissions as he wishes. His business is simply to oversee the supply as a whole on the assumption that it will be sufficient. Where he becomes concerned is with illegal tapping into the conduits, the many different ways in which people might seek to take water without imperial permission, or indeed without paying for it. As I say, his constant emphasis is on fraud and on illegal tapping, perhaps because this was easier to combat and easier to identify. You could say it's easier to identify secret pipes running under various parts of the city, pipes for which no record actually exists in the curator's office, or indeed the various ingenious frauds that when one water grant comes to an end because the holder has died, these are not heritable, rather than when the grant is transferred to another person, simply transferring the pipe, The watermen, the aquarii, his subordinates, would fit a new pipe and use the old one to siphon off water which they could then sell. Again, Frontinus' concern is not so much with the volume of water that's being lost as with the legality or illegality of tapping in. Now, in broad terms, we could say perhaps Frontinus' approach is less economics than management, if we take these modern categories. How to operate a pre-existing system. He doesn't question how the system exists. He doesn't really go into details about the principles by which it's been created, other than occasional hints that actually it is largely haphazard. There are points where Frontinus discusses the construction of the aqueducts, where, rather than saying the city had grown so that an increase in the water supply was required, he says it seemed from the growth of the city that an increase in water supply was required. So to some extent, the decision of earlier Roman magistrates and emperors to build new aqueducts is being presented as something which is not wholly based in the reality of Rome's water needs, so much as in perceptions that there might need to be an increase in water supply. For the most part, however, Frontinus takes for granted the system that he's inherited, the particular routes of the different aqueducts, the fact that different aqueducts bring in varying qualities of water, some of which he says is not fit for drinking and is barely fit for watering gardens. So again, there's a certain complaint about what he has to deal with, but he takes his task to be how to make this run as effectively as possible, to increase the total volume of water available by reducing illegal depredations and leaks, and therefore to be able to distribute the water more effectively by ensuring that the best quality water is directed towards drinking fountains and the like, leaving the worst quality water to be passed over to more menial uses, such as washing out the sewers, watering gardens, and so forth. So in those terms, we can take Frontinus to be, as I say, certainly rational, instrumentally orientated, in some senses modern. But there are plenty of respects in which his approach is much less modern. He doesn't push various questions as far as we might, as I've said. He doesn't question the goals which he has been given. It is taken entirely for granted that public uses are placed above private uses, all other things being equal, but the fact that the emperor can intervene in any way he wishes without any consideration for the system as a whole is taken for granted. Frontinus' sort of highest principle is the emperor dispenses as he likes. There are points where perhaps he almost verges on a critique, not directly in relation to the distribution of water grants, but when talking about the personnel of the aqueducts. Under the reign of Augustus, work on the aqueducts had been conducted by a group of slaves owned by Agrippa, Augustus' son-in-law, who had been responsible for many of these constructions. This group of slaves was left to Augustus by Agrippa, and then sometime later Augustus left them to the city of Rome. So there is this confusion of public and private, which in fact is a persistent theme in discussions of the workings of the Roman Principate. In the same way, the question of who pays for the aqueducts and what happens to any revenue gathered from those who pay a rent for their water rights seems distinctly blurred, or at least the distinction between the personal treasury of the emperor and the resources of the state is very unclear. But more than this, Frontinus operates the system according to a set of what we might term moralizing principles. His sense of how water should be distributed is driven to a great extent by the idea that there are good and better ways in which water might be used. There is a regular contrast not only between public and private, but rather between public usus. I mean, usus here has a wide range of meanings. It can simply mean use or employment, but it appears to imply in Frontinus the basic needs of drinking and washing. So on the one hand, there is public usus. On the other hand, there is private voluptas. There is private pleasure. And these are put together. We don't get any discussion of private usus, or only a rare discussion of private usus. We certainly don't get a discussion of public pleasure, where, for example, bathhouses fit is actually somewhat ambiguous. On the whole, they seem to be treated as part of usus, as part of the basics of life, and therefore a suitable way of using some of Rome's water supply, rather than suspicious pleasure. This is, as I mentioned earlier, fitted into a fairly sketchy but nevertheless powerful discourse of historical development, which echoes the sorts of historical accounts offered by writers from the late Republic of the Augustan period, namely primary virtue, later decadence. In the good old days, the Romans had not needed aqueducts. They had been content with water from the Tiber, water from wells and springs. The fact that the Romans now have aqueducts is to some extent a sign of their decline. They are to be marvelled at. There's the famous line, which I've given you under section 4, where Frontinus emphasises the usefulness of the Romans' architectural marvels as opposed to pyramids and Greek constructions. It's not clear what he means by Greek constructions, but we can imagine something like the Colossus of Rhodes, for example. Frontinus takes pride in the fact that the Romans invest in constructions that are primarily useful. But nevertheless, it is to some extent a sign that Rome is no longer as virtuous as it once was, as well as no longer being as small as it once was. The most striking aspect of what we might term Frontinus's pre-modern attitude is, of course, what he does not talk about. And that is the idea of what we would term productive uses of water. He has very little to say about how water is actually used once it has passed through the channels for which he is responsible. But when he does, it's a very undifferentiated category. He refers in the same sentence to baths and fulleries. Now, fulleries are vital parts of the cloth manufacturing process. This is the only form of industrial craft production to which Frontinus refers, and it's left ever so slightly ambiguous as to whether he sees this as in any way a necessity. But certainly the idea that there are other ways in which water might be employed in the city, which would be vital for the city's success and survival, this is not considered. There is no mention of the use of water power. Now, it is open to debate whether this is because there was very little use of water power in the city of Rome, but there is at least some indication that this could be used, and indeed may have been used more than we imagine. At the very least, there clearly was the capacity for using water power, using the water being brought in by the aqueducts, without in any way affecting its quality for other purposes. This is not something that Frontinus is interested in the slightest. He makes passing reference to the importance of water for agriculture, but largely in a disparaging manner, to complain about people stealing aqueduct water in order to irrigate their gardens. The fact that these gardens might have been important parts of Rome's food supply doesn't enter his consideration. His focus, as I say, is on what we might term either the basic uses of water for drinking and washing, or the more leisure-orientated, consumption-orientated uses of water for bathhouses, fountains, and the like. The idea of water as a resource for production is not something that really finds any interest in his discussion. It might be going too far to say that this confirms our general perspective of Roman attitudes towards industry as something which is simply not only not worth mentioning, but actually beneath notice. It's a very conventional view of the development of Roman technology that the people who had the resources to invest in it, the emperor, the upper classes, not only had no interest, but had an active disdain for anything involving machinery, anything involving manufacturing. That whereas agriculture was a respected way of making a living, and indeed even investing in highly industrialized agriculture could nevertheless lay claim to traditional virtue, other forms of activity were avoided. But certainly Frontinus' attitude is compatible with such a perspective. Although what we see in his work are hints that this is not a universal view. Behind Frontinus' work, we have all of the indications that there are many people seeking to gain access to the water supply through legal or illegal means. Some of these, perhaps, were members of the elite who simply wanted nice fountains or personal bathhouses. But we might suspect that those who are driven to tap into the conduits were those who wanted to gain access to water for a wide variety of means, not simply their own pleasure, but in order to support their livelihood. Indeed, although Frontinus doesn't discuss it directly, we can imagine a fairly clear hierarchical division of access to water. How easy would it be for a lower class craftsman to get a grant from the emperor to tap into the water conduits? We might be sceptical about that. The most likely recipients of imperial grants would be members of the Roman elite, who would be precisely interested in their own pleasure at least as much as in putting this to any productive use. So behind Frontinus' discussion, and above all behind Frontinus' concern with all the people who are stealing his water and tapping into the conduits and taking advantage of leaks and even trying to take too much of the water that spills out of the basins, what he refers to as lapsed water, with the view that, in fact, this is much better used for cleaning out the sewers rather than being taken off for private use, that what we have is a whole infrastructure of the city that needs access to water, but is almost systematically denied an easy access to that water. Frontinus' system, for all that he presents it as rational, organised, and devoted to the highest principles of the use of the city, actually reflects much more the social hierarchy. And indeed, ultimately, this seems to be his assumption. The water supply flows through the beneficence of the emperor. It flows to the people as a whole, not because they possess any individual right, but because the emperor has chosen that his city should be supplied with water. The emperor has also chosen that various individuals should gain access to the supply because they have won his favour, again, not because they have necessarily any special claim to it. And indeed, Frontinus himself falls into this pattern. The closing words of his book are where he sets out the new Senate rescript, introducing serious punishments for anyone who has been illegally tapping into the conduits. But Frontinus says, there are those who have been lulled into a false sense of security because this issue has been neglected for so long. They need to be handled more gently. And so he took pains that as far as possible their names should not be known, that they were given the opportunity to go to the emperor and apologise and have their water stealing regularised. And Frontinus says he has therefore been put in a position to give them a favour, the implication being he will receive their gratitude in return. So for all of Frontinus's high principles about dealing with fraud, about maintaining the integrity of the water system, his closing words are that in fact he's quite happy to bend those rules as part of the general give and take of Roman patronage and friendship. And that brings me to the broader picture of the operation of the Roman water supply, not just Frontinus's very particular perspective on it, and the broader picture of the economy of Rome. The extent to which Frontinus' picture largely ignores the role of power and money and seeks to reduce everything to the simple hydraulics of the flow of water and a simple rule about who can and cannot put in their own pipe. The water distribution clearly is distorted. It's not based on principles of need or justice, it's based on the will of the emperor and those who have greater means to buy a share of it. Not necessarily directly, but because they are the sort of people who can gain a beneficium from the emperor. Above all, it's a system which ignores the greater needs of a significant proportion of the population. They may be receiving drinking water, and that's undeniably important, but there is no concern at all for those who may require water as a basis for their livelihood, for their manufacturing activities, and so forth. The whole infrastructure of production in the city is almost entirely neglected, apart from a very brief mention of fooleries. Water flows through the same basic structures as other things. It is brought into the city of Rome from outside through the exercise of superior political power. Grain comes to the city because Rome has conquered other provinces and demands grain as tribute. Water comes to the city because Rome has power over the countryside around and can plant channels and draw off springs wherever it wants. And again, there is a passing mention in Frontinus to the fact that the farmers of one of the areas outside Rome will have lost the use of water because it is being channeled to the city. This, you would say, from the perspective of the Roman elite, is how things are expected to operate. They don't use the idea of trickle down, but it virtually is. Power, water, influence start at the top with the emperor. They flow to the Roman elite and then eventually percolate down to the rest of the population. Frontinus' assumption that there is generally always enough to go round, providing no one takes more than their fair share, is applied equally to the wealth of the empire. The city of Rome in general benefits from the flow of goods and resources, even if the rest of the empire has to suffer. What we don't get, and this is also true of the political economy of the empire as a whole, is the sense of individual rights, whether to water or whether to the proceeds of empire. The task of imperial agents like Frontinus is rather like that of those who are sent out to rule the provinces of the empire, simply to ensure that the flow continues, rather than asking any broader questions about it. And with that, I think I should draw this to a close. Thank you.